Hi, my name is Soumya Basu, and I'm here today to present StableFees, a predictable fee market for cryptocurrencies. This is joint work with David Easley, Maureen O'Hara, and Emin at Cornell University. So, a fundamental problem for all blockchains is how to allocate space to competing needs. So for example, you may have a user who's trying to buy a coffee, you may have another user that's trying to participate in an ICO, and you may have another user that's trying to send $1,000 into an exchange. And figuring out which transactions to prioritize and confirm first is a difficult problem. So how all cryptocurrencies do it currently is by using a first price auction on transaction fees. So each of those transactions will have some fee attached to it, and once that gets included in the block, the transactions will be charged whatever they bid. Now, first price auctions have some nice properties. So they're spam proof and resistant to minor manipulation, but they have one big downside, which is instability in fees. So we see that like in Bitcoin, in December 2017, the fees ratcheted up very quickly as demand for block size grew, and as the demand collapsed, the fees ratcheted back down. And we can actually see that, and we can actually start to reason about why this problem is there. And it's because it's very difficult when a user is choosing the fee to actually pick the right fee. So you could, if the user picks a lower fee than they were willing to pay, and that fee prohibits them from getting into the block, it leads to a really bad user experience. So you have questions about like, why is my Bitcoin transaction taking so long to confirm? And the reason is they didn't pay enough fees. And what's actually the most interesting part about this Bitcoin Stack Exchange post is that the user actually admits that they now realize the fee was too low and they'd be willing to pay more to get their transaction confirmed. So we actually see this underpayment problem in the wild, where some user was waiting for 2 weeks to get their transaction on the chain. Now, the second problem is you could just decide to overpay, like just always pay the maximum amount you're willing to pay to get the transaction on the chain. But that can also be very, very expensive. So what people have resorted to doing is by using some kind of simple heuristics, by looking at the mempool or by looking at historical fees or something like that. And those lead to ratcheting behavior where the fees sort of will get bid up and then collapse once they become too expensive. And this actually just exacerbates the problem of overpayment. So the key insight of this paper is that the current fee market operates very much like a first price auction. And the thing that's nice is that equilibria in first price auctions are Pareto optimal, but these equilibria are very difficult to achieve in practice. And the reason is that the optimal bid for a particular user not only depends on their preferences, but it depends on what the other bids are doing. And we can actually see this in the wild in a different context. So if we look at internet sponsored search auctions from Overture, we can see this ratcheting behavior quite clearly, where initially the auction was won at about $6, and then people realized, okay, I'm okay with bidding more than that, so they'll bid $6 plus a little bit more, and then that will keep ratcheting up the price, and then once the price becomes too high, everyone exits from the auction and the price comes crashing down again, and then the whole cycle repeats. We'll take a look at the variance of Bitcoin and Ethereum in the empirical analysis towards the end of the talk. So the question is, how do we now implement the fixes from sponsored search auctions in cryptocurrencies? And the thing is, we can't just sort of take the second price auctions that were the solution and just port them over, because cryptocurrency auctions kind of present their own unique challenges. So when a user is constructing a bid for a transaction, the bid is done in a much more adversarial environment. And by that, a user when they construct a bid in Bitcoin, the next block is always happening on expectation 10 minutes away, which means that the number of transactions that are coming in are unknown. And even worse, every single one of those transactions can see and react to whatever the user has bid, but the user obviously can't see into the future, so the user has to react to some unknown. So it's kind of this weird asymmetric game that a user is playing when they're trying to figure out what they're going to bid. Additionally, miners aren't trusted auctioneers. There is no sort of natural trusted auctioneer in cryptocurrencies. So miners, you can impose some rules on the auctions, but in terms of which transactions actually get put on the block, miners will only put the ones that they're incentivized to put in the block. However, we do have one benefit that from the mining process. Because miners are getting paid in the cryptocurrency that they're mining, they can take the health of the system as a whole as a secondary concern. So if there are two options that are sort of that they have equal payoffs for, they'll do the one that's more beneficial for the system as a whole. So the contributions of this paper are as follows. We redesigned the fee mechanism, and we're calling this redesigned stable fees. And we have some accompanying analysis and provable properties in a theoretical model. We're the first such redesign to optimize the social welfare for all participants in the system. And a key feature is that it allows fees to be set in a predictable way. And while one particularly surprising result from our analysis is if stable fees was implemented in December 2017, Bitcoin users could have saved over $250 million in transaction fees. So stable fees is inspired by the second price auctions in the VCG procedure. It has a few nice properties. First, users are incentivized to bid their true value. And by that, the user that's, say, putting in or transferring $1,000 into an exchange may be willing to pay at most $50 to put their transaction in. Before, what would happen is the user would sort of check the mempool and see how little they could get away with paying. With stable fees, they just bid $50. The second thing is that stable fees, as I mentioned before, maximizes social welfare. Additionally, we have some proofs about how it's resistant against different kinds of manipulation by users and miners. So let's talk about the algorithm. So a user constructs a transaction and attaches a bid to the transaction, which is the amount that they're willing to pay to get this confirmed. The transaction will then go into the peer-to-peer network and eventually make its way to a miner. A miner will then grab a group of these transactions together and construct a full block of them. I put an asterisk by the full because there's different ways of satisfying the full block criteria, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So what happens now in the auction is that the transaction is charged the minimum fee in the block, and the miner, instead of being paid just the fees that they from this block, the miner will instead be paid the average fee that was collected over the last B blocks, where B is a protocol set, a parameter. So a full block, so a block is considered full in one of the three ways. The first way is if some large percentage of the block is actually filled with transactions. So think of it as being 80 or 90% filled with transactions. That's a full block. The second way is if a miner says the mempool was too empty. There aren't enough transactions to actually fill the block. In that case, there's not enough demand for block space to actually justify high fees. So all fees will instead of getting charged the minimum fee in the block, will get charged whatever minimum fee is required for a transaction to be declared valid. So for example, in Bitcoin, if there's a rule that says all transactions must pay at least 0.01 BTC to be considered considered valid, all the transactions in the second category will get charged that 0.01 BTC, regardless of what the min fee is in the block. And the last way is for the miner to say, I'm not filling up this block, but I would have filled it with spam transactions to try and manipulate the results of this auction. So there's this fee penalty that the miner can pay. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the idea here is that we want to make sure that the miner isn't spamming the chain with fake transactions and can have a way to construct a smaller block. So the first question we need to ask about our proposal is, are the highest values transactions indeed the ones that are getting put in the block? So we guarantee this in two ways. The first is that the miner's payout is affected directly by the current block that they mined. So the B blocks that the miner's fee reward is averaged over includes the block that the miner just mined. So the more fees the miner collects, the higher their payout will be. Additionally, if there happen to be two sets of transactions which will give them an equal payout, because the miner cares about the health of the cryptocurrency, they're going to pick the set with the highest value transactions. So now we'll get into the different types of manipulations that can happen. The first type of manipulation is the miner can try and submit fake bids to try and increase the payout from this block. The second thing that can happen is a user can try and manipulate their own bids to try and pay a little bit less. And the third way is for a user to pay the miner on the side to include them in the auction results and to try and circumvent the auction entirely. So the first manipulation mechanism we'll talk about is fake bids by miners. The key observation here is that when a miner is submitting a fake bid, that fake bid will be equal to the minimum bid imposed by any real user. So if a real user's bid is $10, and that's the minimum bid in the block that the miner wants to include, if a miner's fake transaction bids $11, $12, $13, that will just be charged $10 by our algorithm, which means there's no point in the miner bidding higher. And the miner, of course, is not going to bid lower than $10 because that means that they're setting the price for the block, and which means they're not collecting as many fees from the user. So the fee penalty will basically charge the miner the amount they would have been charged if they filled the block with transactions that are equal to the lowest bid in the block. And the reason the miner will use the fill penalty mechanism instead of spamming the block is, all else being equal, the miner would prefer smaller blocks because they propagate faster through the network. However, I just kind of explained how the miner can manipulate, but we actually have a result that shows that the gain that the miner can get from doing this kind of manipulation actually decreases as the number of miners increase, or the mining power decreases, and as the number of users increases. Is there a question? Or? I'd need to think about that a little bit more. My first guess would be that we don't that if a user is willing to pay some amount of money to get a transaction on the chain, the purpose behind that transaction is not really something the protocol can take into account. But I'm happy to discuss more after. Okay. There, so the way I'm describing the fee or the structure now, yes, but instead of talking about fees, you can just as easily talk about fee per byte, which is how transactions are ranked anyway in Bitcoin. So the next kind of manipulation is if there are side payments to the miner. Last question. Oh, from this one. So the reason this decreases with okay, so the key thing is when B is high, the chances of you recovering the amount you spent to do the manipulation becomes lower. So it's it's a little more detailed, but the fundamental reason is like because you're getting an average over many blocks, the chances of you recovering all of the fees that you spent to do the manipulation becomes lower and lower as the number of miners increase. No. The cost is only paid if you get to add the block. But it's if you add the block, right? If you don't get to add the block, then you didn't really pull off this attack. You just mined a block that never made it on the chain. Okay. I'm gonna defer more questions to the end for the sake of time. Okay. So the second kind of manipulation is if the user tries to pay the miner on the side. So we look at these as transactions that have kind of intrinsic value to the miner, so a value that's not recorded in the bid itself, and this can be in addition to side payments. This could be transactions that are that occur, such as the mining pool payout or any secondary services that the miner themselves is providing. And we do have, and we said that when you have a full block, you only need to fill it like 80 to 90%. That small 10 to 20% is for these kinds of transactions. And the thing is, the space for these kinds of transactions is very limited, so they're only available at a premium cost. So miners here are incentivized to drop user transactions that are paying less than the auction fee. So finally, we'll talk about user bid manipulation. So the reason first price auctions, users were encouraged to manipulate their bids is because whatever they bid is the amount that they would actually pay if they got on the chain. So here in stable fees, whoever the kth price user is, the minimum fee in the block, that user is actually setting their own bid as well. So theoretically, that user could benefit from shading their bid down. But the result that we have is as the number of users increase, basically a particular user being lucky enough to get into that exact spot to be the one to pay their own bid, that chance goes down, which means that the gain from this kind of manipulation actually decreases as the number of users increase. And the interesting part of this result is that this is actually holds true in any equilibria of stable fees. So finally, we did some empirical analysis on stable fees, and we looked at some historical analysis on the Bitcoin and Ethereum chains, and we also ran some simulations using bids. So the first is in Bitcoin and Ethereum, the fee mechanism really matters when there's high usage. If no one is using the chain, then it kind of doesn't matter whether you do first price or second price or something else. So we looked at the height of the last bull run in December 2017, and we asked ourselves the following question: what happens if StableFees was implemented? And in particular, we looked at two effects. The first is how much could users have saved? And the second is how predictable would miner fee payouts have become? So if we look at Bitcoin, on a per day basis, users overpaid from anywhere from about $2 to $20 million, and the total fees they could have saved is over a $250 million. And this is if they had implemented a stable fees for the duration of December 2017 instead of using the current first price mechanism. In Ethereum, the throughput is higher, so the numbers are slightly smaller. In Ethereum, on a per day basis, they saved about they would have saved about $100,000 to $650,000, and the total savings is on the order of $13 million. So our numbers are quite compelling in terms of just how much in raw fees users would have saved, but they actually ignore some additional costs. The first cost is that it ignores the overhead on users to pick the right fee. So users can use fee estimators or other mechanisms, and there's a cost associated with that. And also, as we talked about before, underbids also cost users in waiting time. Additionally, we looked at the variability in between the current mechanism and stable fees. We see that stable fees has lower variance in payouts. And the thing that's important about variance reduction is it allows miners to plan for the longer term. And these payouts are based much more on the demand for the block space. And additionally, a note here is that B parameter I talked about also reduces the variance by a factor of B squared. So you can reduce the variance even further in an actual instantiation of stable fees. We kind of picked the worst case for our comparison, though. And finally, I want to talk about our experiments. We drew user bids from a power law with a mean of 10 cents and a median of 2 cents. The miners can manipulate by dropping some transactions, which increases the min transaction fee paid by users. Here in our results, we'll present equal power miners, and we look at the miner gain from manipulation. So in our first graph, on the x-axis, we have the number of miners. On the y-axis, we have the gain from manipulation in US dollars. Note that the y-axis is a log scale, so these drop-offs are actually quite a bit more significant than you're seeing on the graph. So we see that as the number of miners increase, the gain from manipulation drops off. And similarly, as the number of blocks we're averaging the payout over increase, the gain from miner manipulation also drops off. So in conclusion, a big challenge in this space is usability. And having an unpredictable fee mechanism makes the cryptocurrencies very hard to use because you may get stuck or you may be paying too much. And it's just a much worse experience. So we presented stable fees, which is a restructuring of the fee market from first principles. It's the first such proposal to optimize social welfare and have some proven non-manipulation properties. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
So could we go back to the very first slide, the view from 10,000 feet?
Yeah.
The statements that you make here, they are not entirely the case. So the first price auction is a miner strategy. It's not a rule of the game, and it's actually a very crude approximation of what's actually happening, because miners are completely free to pick whatever transactions they want, and the first price auction that you use to model is not actually what they do. So you can look at the blockchain right now and see that there are plenty of transactions with zero fee that still get into the blockchain. And you can also see a bunch of cheap transactions that go into the blockchain. which are much cheaper than what the first price auction mechanism would predict. And the reason for that is that miners have sweetheart deals, typically with exchanges, because mining is a very competitive business and the profit margins are very thin. And the vast majority of the coins that the miners mine, they need to sell immediately on the exchange in order to cover their electricity bills. And therefore, they need a working relationship with exchanges. And in exchange, and what they offer to exchanges is that they include their transactions in the blockchain for free in exchange for having priority access to exchanges. That's very standard practice, happens all the time. And the other mechanism is the so-called child pays for parent. So Bitcoin transactions, they, oh, sorry, I tried to be short. So, and what you mentioned here, the user experience problem with a tweet from 2016. So now user interfaces have gotten a lot better. And right now, if you're using a Bitcoin wallet, a mobile wallet, then figuring out a good fee and correcting if you picked it wrong is a very trivial thing, and it's no longer a user experience problem. So I think that, I mean, this is a very crude approximation of reality, and I think that it misses some essential features.
So I think the side relationships you talked about is exactly why we set aside 10 to 20% of the block space, because you're right, there is some part of the blocks that are set aside for this kind of stuff. But if you look at, for most users, like, I don't have a working relationship with the miners, so like I'm going through a first price auction, and with child pays for parent, yes, you can adjust your bids up, but again, this is something that, like, I now have to monitor how my transaction is doing, and if it's not getting confirmed, I can bid my transaction, or I can bid it up. But like these are all sort of crude workarounds for a mechanism that doesn't quite work the way we want it to. So you're right. There is some amount of modeling going on here where we're not quite capturing all of the details, but I think we do take it into account in the actual proposal.